Designed for special operations in mind, the X207 Blitz was the Alliance's first mobile suit using the X200 frame, a variant of the more standard X100 frame that was used for the Duel, the Buster, and the Strike. What made the Blitz so special though was its Mirage colloid stealth system. Through the dispersion of special particles, the machine would be made completely invisible to both the naked eye and sensors. It was quite literally the perfect camouflage, but it wasn't without its flaws. First of all, the machine had to be designed completely around the system, which is also why the X200 frame was used in the first place. Because, in order for the machine to be completely cloaked, those special particles had to be dispersed from various parts of the body. And to maximize the effect, it wasn't just the frame and the armor that were designed with the system in mind, but even the weapons. Unlike the other G weapons, the Blitz's standard weapons didn't include any handheld equipment, and instead, it would use integrated weapon systems. On the left arm, it had the Gleipnir rocket anchor, which could be used for either damaging the enemy or reeling in the enemy to finish him off at close range, and on the right arm, it had the Trikeros or Trikeros offensive shield system. It comes packing with a 50mm high energy beam rifle, which is comparable to the standard beam rifles of the other G weapons, 3 Lancer Dart hypervelocity kinetic energy penetrators, which are pretty much rockets, which could also be used as handheld spears in emergency situations, and a beam saber. Again, comparable to the standard beam sabers used by the other G weapons. For defensive purposes then, the Trikeros isn't just comparable to the other shields, it is actually superior. Because not only is it coated with an anti-beam coating, but it's now an integral part of the mobile suit itself, and is therefore protected by the G weapons' signature phase shift armor. The power-hungry shielding system that makes him impervious to physical attacks. But this is also where we encounter one of the first weaknesses of the Mirage colloid system. While the system is active, the phase shift armor can't be active, making the Blitz weak to physical attacks, like for example, sea whiz guns on a battleship. And it's also not as simple as just evading the sea whiz barrage to keep up the cover. Because the Mirage colloid system relies on particles to cloak the Blitz, using thrusters, or even just moving around too much, would lessen the cloaking effect. So typically, the Blitz would approach its targets using only inertial movement. Another downside of the system was that it was limited to only about 80 to 85 minutes, limiting the range in which it could be used. Still, the system would prove to be extremely lethal, especially against enemies who weren't expecting it. On January 25th, Cosmic Era 71, the Blitz, along with the Duel, the Buster, and the Aegis, were stolen by Zaft commandos, who then began pursuing the 5th and final unit that was still in Alliance hands. In a bid to escape their Zaft pursuers though, they fled to Artemis, a Eurasian Federation fortress that was deemed to be impregnable thanks to a lightwave barrier system known as the Umbrella of Artemis. Although, what definitely helped to support its impregnable status was that it was in a strategically unimportant location, so Zaft never really bothered to lay siege to it, because it did have one weakness. The Umbrella was very energy hungry, so it was turned off when no enemies were around, creating the perfect opportunity for the Blitz to sneak in and wreak havoc upon the unsuspecting fortress. Once inside, the Blitz was able to destroy many of the generators for the Umbrella, as well as a large portion of Artemis's defense forces, completely crippling it. It was able to single-handedly turn the fortress from the Eurasian Federation's pride and joy into a laughingstock, a reputation that it wouldn't shed for many years. So don't let this happen to you online by using NordVPN to cloak your online activities. It is the top VPN around, and it's become my daily driver for dodging those pesky region locks. And if you use the link down below or the code kkrt, you'll not just get a sweet discount, but you'll also be supporting the channel. The attack on Artemis then perfectly highlighted the meaning of the Blitz's name. It's German for lightning, and the Blitz was definitely capable of striking like lightning. And in the Gundam Seed RE manga, the original Blitz, which was piloted by Nickel Amalfi, was upgraded by Zaft with specialized atmospheric equipment. This pack consisted of din-like main wings for atmospheric flight, and also a pair of claw-like subwings, which had a very nasty bite to them. By using the Mirage Colloid system, these claws were somehow able to drain energy from an enemy and absorb it into the Blitz. Still, despite all of its power, the Blitz would eventually be defeated. Still in heavy pursuit of the strike, the Blitz would be struck down when the strike swung its Schwertgewehr anti-ship sword, penetrating the cockpit and killing the pilot. But this wouldn't be the end of the Blitz's lineage. It would get quite a few variants, and even parts of the original one would keep on serving. Because during that battle with the strike, it first lost its right arm, which then safely crashed on the ground. So when the Blitz later blew up because the strike swung at it, the arm was still intact. This right arm was then recovered by Orb, who just happened to have an experimental mobile suit of their own, which needed a new right arm, turning the Astray Gold Frame into the Astray Gold Frame Amatsu. And at first, this was a very easy fix. The right arm of the Blitz was quite literally bolted onto the gold frame, and, well, at this stage, the changes were purely cosmetic. There was an extra red line on the shoulder armor, and the fingertips were made more pointier for a more edgy look. Other changes were that the white parts of the armor were now painted black, and the damaged head was replaced with an upgraded version that also featured an extra mono-eye sensor. But the most important thing about this quick fix was that Morgan Raid was able to get the Mirage Colloid system up and running again, which then also gave them all the information they needed about this system. The big drawback then was that rather than the Mirage Colloid particles being spread from the entire body, only the right arm could now spread them. The entire machine could still be cloaked, but there was no doubt some kind of performance hit. And if the pilot so wanted, it was now also possible to just cloak that right arm to catch the enemy off guard. The completed version then had a few more modifications, like a stabilizer fin on the left arm and a new array of weapons. First of all, the Trikeros was changed to the Trikeros Kai. It still had the 3 kinetic penetrators, but the 50mm high energy beam rifle and the beam saber had now been combined. And the shield portion was made smaller and got a sharper edge, turning it into more of a blade than a shield. But the biggest difference was the new backpack, which also housed completely new weapons. The main weapons were 2 Maga no Ikutachi energy absorption blades, which worked very similar to the energy-sucking claws of the Blitz's manga-only atmospheric backpack. Originally, the idea was that the Mirage Colloid system would create a field around the gold frame, and whatever enemy stepped into this field would have its energy drained. But in this first iteration, the effectiveness of this field wasn't yet optimized, so the blades needed to make contact with the enemy to effectively suck them dry. And it was even capable of completely draining nuclear-powered mobile suits. The excess energy that couldn't be absorbed by the gold frame would then simply be discharged into the air. So the name of this weapon was very fitting, because Maga no Ikutachi means a sword that brings disaster upon the enemy while preserving one's own life. And they have yet another weapon stored inside of them, to bring even more disaster upon their foes. The Maga no Shira Hoko, sometimes also listed as the Magashira no Hoko, but the former is what you'll find in official sources. However you want to call them though, these are spear tips that can be shot out, and they have a wire attached to them, so they can be retracted for repeated usage. And thanks to the tip being made out of phase shift armor, they have an exceptionally high penetration rate. The only thing they don't have though is thrusters, but the pilots of this machine, being Rondo Gina Sahaku and later Rondo Mina Sahaku, have such great skill that they make it look like the Magano Shirahoko's trajectory is actually controllable. At a later date then, the gold frame would again be damaged, and it would get another round of upgrades, this time turning it into the Astray gold frame Amatsu Mina, named after its new pilot, Rondo Mina Sahaku. The biggest changes were the new leg armor, styled after that of the Blitz, and even more weapons. However, despite maybe sounding a bit brutal, these weapons were actually meant to disable an enemy mobile suit without killing the pilot, which was part of Mina's philosophy. So first up, we have two Totsuka no Tsurugi sabers, which are stored on the side skirts. These rapiers aren't suited for slashing attacks like traditional beam sabers, but they are extremely effective at pinpoint attacks against joints and sensors. This makes them very difficult to use, but when used correctly, they can easily disable an enemy mobile suit without dealing excessive damage. The name of these swords comes from the sword that Susanoo no Mikoto used to slay Yamato no Orochi in Japanese mythology. And the second new weapon is the Tsumaha no Tachi Claw, another close combat weapon whose main goal isn't to deal the maximum amount of damage, but is instead used to either disarm the enemy or to throw him off balance. And the name of this claw supposedly comes from the Kusanagi no Tsurugi, which is a sword that emerged from the Yamato no Orochi's tail after it was slain by Susanoo no Mikoto. And this sword would become one of the 3 regalia of the Japanese royal family. And later again, this claw would be replaced by the Okitsuno Kagami offensive beam shield system. This was a development from the lightwave barrier system that we talked about earlier, and can be used to both deflect incoming attacks or to attack enemies as if it was a beam blade. And to do this, it had quite some options. It was mounted on a rocket-propelled pile bunker, it could be shot out with its own thrusters, or it could be used as a whip thanks to the wire that was installed to retract it after it was shot out. The name then is taken from one of the 10 sacred treasures from Japanese mythology, to which the 3 regalia of the royal family also belong. What was less noticeable from the outside then was that the insides had also been revamped, giving it a higher performance of about 30% and atmospheric flight capabilities. All in all, these upgrades made the gold frame a top-class machine during the Second Bloody Valentine War, even though its base form was from the First Bloody Valentine War. And these modifications for the gold frame would also be applied to a custom Blitz Gundam that was used by Librarian Works, the Nebula Blitz. Most of the body remained the same as that of the standard Blitz, and it even still had the standard Triggeros and Gleipnir equipped to its arms. The upgrades in terms of weapons then are that in place of its side skirts, it now got a rack with extra Lancer darts and the Tsumaha no Tachi Claw, both of which could be swapped out with the Triggeros if the situation called for it. And on its back, the standard backpack was removed in favor of a Striker Pack compatible plug, just like Librarian Works did with all of their mobile suits. It could now technically use any Striker Pack it wanted, but it would typically be outfitted with the Maga no Ikutachi Striker. And as the name indicates, this was basically the backpack of the Astray Goldframe Amatsu, but Striker packified. This then gave the Nebula Blitz access to the Magashiru no Hoko shot lancers, which worked really well in combination with the Gleipnir, allowing it to attack enemies from 3 directions, and of course the Maga no Ikutachi energy absorption blades, which allowed the Nebula Blitz to absorb the energy from enemies. And because the Nebula Blitz was a machine built for Mirage Colloid technology, it was of course also very compatible with this weapon. And in addition to sucking the enemies dry, they could also be used to physically crush the enemy, like a pincer claw. The other upgrades then consisted of better sensors in the head, better cooling systems in the head, and the Mirage Colloid teleport system. A very interesting use of the Mirage Colloid system that relied on a particular skill of its pilot, Lilly Thevalley. But before we talk about her skills, we have to talk about who or what she is, because Lilly isn't just your average pilot, nor is she your average human. She's a carbon human. To keep a long story short, carbon humans are humans that are quite literally made by Librarian Works, and they are grown in special tanks. Through genetic manipulation, they can be made into a carbon copy of an existing human, or they can let the carbon human develop naturally, creating a new person. And Lilly was one of those original carbon humans who wasn't a copy of anyone. The manipulation that they did do, though, was to split her fertilized egg into 20, which then resulted in 20 identical Lillys being born. And these 20 Lillys were each given a Nebula Blitz. And in addition to being excellent pilots, the Lillys also possessed quantum communication capabilities amongst themselves, and with this ability, it allowed them to pull off that Mirage Colloid teleport system. By alternating the activation of their Mirage Colloid systems, they would make it look like the enemy was fighting one teleporting mobile suit rather than multiple cloaked mobile suits. Great for when you want to deceive an enemy in an honorable one-on-one duel, but probably less effective in actual combat. And another striking difference with the original Blitz was the very bright red color scheme. This was personally requested by the Lillys because it's the personal color of good Ver. Also, the LN in the machine's model number stands for Librarian Nebula, and Nebula is Latin for mist. No doubt a reference to the fact that the machine can vanish as if it were in the mist, or the mist itself. But that wasn't the only Blitz that Librarian Works had. They also had the Blitz Lilly Thevalley custom. And unlike the Nebula Blitz, this thing was as good as identical to the original Blitz. The only difference was that it had the newer variable phase shift armor instead of the regular phase shift armor. This meant that it consumed less energy, and that the color of the armor could be changed by changing the voltage of that variable phase shift armor, which then resulted in this very funky color scheme. But just as with the standard phase shift armor, the new VPS armor couldn't be used in conjunction with the Mirage Colloid system. Meanwhile, over at the Alliance then, despite having their single prototype stolen, they also began work on some variants. And the first was the limited production top secret N Dagger N, which was based on the 105 dagger. So to find out more about this machine, you can check out my dagger development history, which is on screen right now and in the description down below. But there is one thing here that needs to be mentioned. The reason that the N Dagger N was top secret was because of both its reactor, which was a nuclear reactor, and because of the Mirage Colloid technology, which was banned from military use by the Junius Treaty, which was concluded at the end of the First Bloody Valentine War. So all of those machines that we just went over, that were still using Mirage Colloid during the Second Bloody Valentine War, were war criminals, although I do feel like that term has lost some of its meaning in the Cosmic Era. More like the Junius suggestion. And their second variant was the Nero Blitz, produced under the Action project. After the First Bloody Valentine War, all 5 of the original G weapons were rebuilt by Action Industries and assigned to a pilot of Phantom Pain. In the case of the Blitz, this was Dana Snip. And then, based on the pilot's feedback, the machines would be customized. Also for the Blitz, the data from the N Dagger N would be used. The biggest change then for the Nero Blitz was a higher focus on close combat and non-beam weaponry. Because of course, flashy beam weapons didn't really mesh all that well with the stealthy Mirage colloid system. So while the Nero still had something that was called the Trick Rose offensive shield system, it was a very different thing. It was now hardwired to the left arm and only carried 3 Lancer darts. Meanwhile, on the right arm, it got a 6-tube missile launcher, which could be loaded with a variety of warheads, including dummy balloons. And the hatches that covered those warheads could now be used as a claw to crush enemies. And finally, its new signature weapons were 2 variable arm units that were mounted on the back. Each one of them had 1 large claw and 3 smaller claws, which were able to even crush machines with phase shift armor. And on top of that, they had a pile bunker for good measure. Plus, they also had an additional defensive feature. They could crystallize themselves by covering their surface with liquid metal, which then somehow turned them invisible and allowed them to reflect incoming beam attacks. However, the downside was that it could only be used a limited amount of times due to wear and tear. Other improvements made by Action include a larger V-fin with a stronger sensor suite and the variable phase shift armor instead of the regular phase shift armor. And as a finishing touch, Phantom Pain equipped the unit with a nuclear fission reactor, something that gave it almost unlimited operational time, including the time that it could be cloaked with the Mirage colloid system. As such, the SR in the model number stands for Stealth Reinforcement, and the name, it was taken from Italian, with Nero meaning black. And the final unit that we have to talk about then is the Duel Blitz Gundam. When Zaft first stole the Alliance's G weapons, the Duel was by far the most basic of the bunch, a little bit too basic for Zaft's taste. So, they decided to do with the Duel what they did with their own mobile suits. Equip it with a set of Assault Shroud, an armor, weapon, and thruster package to give a mobile suit a bit more oomph. This practice was especially popular in the beginning of the war, but as it went on, dedicated Ace Pilot mobile suits overtook the Assault Shroud. But the Duel Assault Shroud was one of those exceptions. At the end of the war then, the Duel, along with the Buster, were placed into storage and were meant to be scrapped. But their eventual fate would turn out to be quite different. Under top secret orders from Eileen Canaver and Azalea Jewel, both members of the Plan Supreme Council, they were instead upgraded for use in an emergency situation. And the one to oversee these upgrades was Yuri Amalfi, the father of Nickel Amalfi, so it's perhaps no coincidence that the new Assault Shroud for the Duel got some very distinct Blitz-inspired elements. On the left arm, it got the XM53S Piercer Lock Gleipnir 2, which was an upgraded version of the Blitz's regular Gleipnir, and on the right arm, it got the XM61 Lancer Dart 2 Hypervelocity Kinetic Energy Penetrator, which was an upgraded version of the Blitz's regular Lancer darts. However, rather than carrying 3 of them, which were stored in a composite weapon system, it just had 2 of them stored in a simple carrying brace. Instead, it would rely on handheld equipment, like the 57mm high-energy beam rifle with underslung grenade launcher, which was the same beam rifle used by the standard Duel, and the MAM-99E Magna Sectio beam saber, a new beam saber that was stored on the left shoulder armor, which also stored the AIM-627G Torrens, a 2-tube missile launcher that fires automatic guided mid-range anti-air missiles, or AGM-RAM for short. And to wrap up its armaments, it still had the same head-mounted Eaglestellum 75mm Seawiz guns, and on the right shoulder, it has the MAM-1600/D2 high-energy beam cannon. This cannon can be used while attached to the shoulder, but if the situation calls for it, it can also be handheld. The main body then is still mostly the same as the standard Duel, but it did get 2 important changes. The cockpit was changed to that of a Zaku series mobile suit, and its reactor was changed with a nuclear reactor. And if all that wasn't enough, it could also dock with a meteor unit for even more power. Isaac Duel was able to use the original Duel to great success during the First Bloody Valentine War, and thanks to these upgrades, he was again able to use it to great success during the Foundation conflict. And that is where the Blitz's development history ends for now. A stealthy machine whose descendants all became walking war crimes, or as they call it in the Cosmic Era, just another Tuesday. So as always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time. Unless you're using the Mirage Colloid, of course.